The small town of Willow Creek nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. For years, life there had been simple and predictable, with everyone knowing their neighbors and working together to keep the community thriving. The townsfolk were mostly farmers relying on the rich soil and steady water sources to grow crops and raise livestock. But everything changed when the rain stopped coming. At first, it was just an unusually dry summer, the kind that made people joke about needing a swim in the creek to cool off. But as weeks turned into months and months stretched into years, the laughter faded, replaced by worry lines etched deep into weathered faces. By the third year of the drought, the once lush landscape had transformed into something unrecognizable. The grass that used to sway gently in the breeze had turned brittle and yellow, crunching underfoot like dried leaves. Trees stood bare, their branches clawing at the sky as if begging for mercy. The rivers that had once flowed freely through the valley now lay empty, reduced to cracked beds of dirt and rock. Even the wells, once reliable lifelines, had begun to fail one by one. People rationed every drop of water they could find, carrying buckets from distant springs or hauling tanks on wagons just to survive. It wasn't long before tempers started to flare, and old friendships began to strain under the weight of scarcity. At the center of this struggle was Emily Carter, a woman whose strength and determination had earned her respect throughout the town. Her family had farmed the same plot of land for generations, and she took immense pride in continuing their legacy. Every sunrise found her out in the fields, tending to her crops and praying for rain. But lately, even her prayers seemed unanswered. Her well, which had always provided enough water for both her home and her farm, had gone completely dry 6 months ago. Without it, she relied solely on the narrow creek that wound its way along the edge of her property. That creek was her lifeline, the only thing keeping her dreams alive. One morning, as Emily trudged down to check the creek, she froze mid-step. Something was wrong. The gentle gurgle of running water, a sound she'd come to cherish during these desperate times, was eerily absent. She hurried closer, her heart pounding in her chest. Sure enough, the creek bed was dry, its smooth stones baking in the harsh sunlight. Panic surged through her. Where had the water gone? Desperate for answers, she followed the path of the creek upstream, her boots kicking up clouds of dust with each step. The farther she walked, the more anxious she became. Finally, after nearly an hour of trekking, she reached the source of the problem. There, blocking the flow of the creek, was a crude but effective dam. Logs and rocks had been piled haphazardly across the width of the stream, forcing the water to divert into a newly dug channel that led straight toward Harold Grayson's property. Emily stared at the sight, her jaw tightening with anger. Harold was her neighbor, a man she'd known for years, someone she'd trusted. How could he do this? The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Harold had stolen her water. Harold Grayson wasn't just any neighbor. He was part of the fabric of Willow Creek, much like Emily herself. They'd shared countless conversations over fence lines, traded tools when equipment broke down, and celebrated holidays together with plates of food passed between their families. In many ways, they were more than neighbors. They were friends. Or at least they had been. Now, standing there, staring at his handiwork, Emily felt a chasm opening between them. This wasn't just about water. It was betrayal. As she stood by the dam, her mind raced with questions. Why would Harold go to such lengths? Was he really so desperate that he'd cut off her supply entirely? She knew his farm was struggling, too, but surely there had to be another way. The thought gnawed at her as she turned and headed back home, her steps heavy with frustration. By the time she reached her house, her resolve had hardened. If Harold thought he could take her water without consequences, he was mistaken. She wouldn't let him destroy everything she'd worked so hard to build. Whatever it took, she would fight back. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emily sat alone on her porch, staring out at the barren fields. The silence around her was oppressive, broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets. She clenched her fists, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. Tomorrow, she decided, she would confront Harold. And if talking didn't work, Well, she'd figure something out. One way or another, she wasn't going to let him win, not this time. The next morning, Emily woke up with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there in weeks. The sky was still cloudless, the sun already blazing despite the early hour. She grabbed her hat, tied it securely under her chin, and marched toward Harold's farm. Her boots kicked up clouds of dust as she walked, each step heavy with determination. She replayed their shared history in her mind. The laughter, the kindness, the moments when they'd helped each other through tough times. But none of those memories softened the anger bubbling inside her. This wasn't just about water anymore. It was about trust shattered and survival at stake. When Emily arrived at Harold's property, she found him standing near his barn, inspecting a patch of wilting corn. His face was lined with stress, his shoulders slumped as though carrying an invisible weight. For a moment, Emily hesitated. Maybe he had a reason for what he'd done. Maybe desperation had driven him to act out of character. But then she noticed the irrigation system humming nearby, its pipes gushing precious water onto his fields while hers remained parched. Any lingering sympathy vanished instantly. "Harold!" she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet morning air. He turned, startled, and his eyes widened slightly when he saw her. "Emily," he said cautiously, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What brings you here?" She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You know exactly why I'm here," she snapped, striding closer until she was standing toe-to-toe with him. "Why did you build that dam? Why are you stealing my water?" Harold sighed deeply, running a hand over his stubbled jaw. Instead of meeting her gaze directly, he looked past her, staring off into the distance as if searching for the right words. Finally, he spoke. "It's not your water, Emily. That creek starts on my land. It's mine to manage how I see fit." His matter-of-fact tone only fueled her fury. "Yours to manage? What about fairness? What about community? You can't just take everything and leave the rest of us to suffer." He finally met her eyes, his expression hardening. "Fairness doesn't put food on the table or keep my animals alive. I've got mouths to feed too, you know. If I don't look out for myself, no one else will." Emily shook her head, disbelief warring with frustration. "So that's it? You're willing to sacrifice everyone else just to save yourself?" "It's not like that," Harold shot back, raising his voice now. "I didn't ask for this drought any more than you did. But if I don't protect what's mine, I'll lose everything. And if I lose everything, who do you think is going to help you when things get worse?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them crackled like dry twigs ready to catch fire. Birds chirped faintly in the background, oblivious to the storm brewing below. Emily clenched her fists, trying to rein in her emotions before speaking again. "This isn't just about you, Harold. We're all struggling. Drought affects every single person in this town. Taking all the water for yourself won't solve anything. It'll make things worse." Harold crossed his arms, his stance defensive. "And what would you have me do, Emily? Share until we both run out? Let my crops die so yours can live? Is that fair?" Her jaw tightened. "No, it's not fair. None of this is fair. But sitting back and letting greed tear us apart isn't the answer either. We used to be friends, Harold. Neighbors. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" He looked away again, his lips pressed into a thin line. There was a flicker of guilt in his eyes, but it disappeared quickly, replaced by stubborn resolve. "I'm sorry, Emily, I really am, but survival isn't pretty. Everyone has to look out for themselves right now. That's just how it is." The finality in his voice stung more than any insult could have. Emily felt her heart sink as the reality of the situation sank in. Harold wasn't going to budge. Not today, maybe not ever. The man she once trusted implicitly was gone, replaced by someone cold and calculating. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed. Arguing wasn't going to change his mind. She needed another plan. As she turned to leave, Harold called, after her. "Wait, Emily." She paused but didn't turn around. "Look," he continued, his tone softer now, almost apologetic. "I don't want it to be like this between us, but I can't afford to lose everything. Please try to understand." She glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "I understand perfectly, Harold. You've made your choice. Now I'll make mine." With that, she strode away, leaving him standing alone in the oppressive heat. As she walked, her mind raced with possibilities. If Harold refused to share, if he insisted on hoarding every last drop of water, then she would find another way to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. She wouldn't let him destroy her livelihood without a fight. Back home, Emily paced the length of her porch, her thoughts swirling like a whirlwind. She thought about the creek, its natural course flowing right through her property before reaching Harold's land. What if she could redirect it entirely? It was a risky idea, one that might escalate tensions even further, but she couldn't ignore the spark of hope it ignited within her. If Harold wanted to play dirty, then fine. She'd show him exactly what she was capable of. Over the next few days, Emily began gathering supplies and sketching out plans late into the night. She borrowed tools from friends, traded favors for materials, and enlisted the help of a few trusted neighbors who sympathized with her plight. Together, they worked, in secret, digging trenches and building barriers under the cover of darkness. Each night brought them closer to completing their mission, and with every shovel of dirt moved, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. But as the project neared completion, whispers of her actions reached Harold's ears. At first, he dismissed them as rumors, refusing to believe Emily would dare defy him. Then one evening he decided to investigate for himself. Walking along the creek bed, he discovered the evidence firsthand. New channels carved into the earth, makeshift dams diverting the flow of water away from his fields. Fury bubbled inside him as he realized what Emily had done. The next morning, Harold stormed onto Emily's property, his face red with rage. "What is this?" he demanded, pointing at the altered creek. "You've stolen my water." Emily stood tall, unflinching in the face of his anger. "No, Harold. This is survival." Emily's declaration hung in the air like a challenge, sharp and unyielding. Harold stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest heaving with barely contained fury. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant chirping of birds and the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a weak breeze. Emily didn't flinch under his glare. Instead, she met his anger with a calm that surprised even herself. She had spent days preparing for this confrontation, knowing it was inevitable. What she hadn't expected was how much resolve she'd feel standing here now, staring down the man who had once been her friend. Harold finally broke the silence, his voice rising to a shout. "You think you're clever, don't you? Diverting the water like some kind of thief in the night. You've crossed a line, Emily." She crossed her arms, her expression unwavering. "I didn't cross any line, Harold. You drew it yourself when you decided to take everything for yourself. I'm just making sure my family and my farm don't go under because of your greed." "Greed?" he spat, taking a step closer. "Is that what you call it? Survival, Emily. That's what this is about. You want to talk about lines? What about the one you crossed by messing with my property? You had no right." Emily tilted her head slightly, her tone icy but controlled. "Funny, isn't it? How quick you are to claim ownership now. Last time I checked, that creek flowed through my land too. You can't hoard something that belongs to everyone." Harold threw up his hands in exasperation. "Belongs to everyone? Is that what you really believe? Because if that's true, then why did you sneak around at night like a criminal to build all this?" He gestured wildly toward the trenches and barriers they'd constructed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "If you're so confident in your cause, why not face me head on?" Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew he had a point. Sort of. Yes, she'd acted secretly, but only because she'd known confronting him directly would lead nowhere. Still, she wasn't about to admit that to him. Instead, she fired back. "Because I knew you'd react exactly like this. Threats, accusations, yelling, all while refusing to listen to reason. Tell me, Harold, when was the last time you actually thought about anyone besides yourself?" Her words hit their mark. Harold's face flushed darker, and for a split second she saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. But it vanished almost instantly, replaced by defiance. Don't try to paint me as the villain here, Emily. I've worked just as hard as you have to keep my farm running. If anything, I've earned the right to protect what's mine. And what about me? She shot back, her voice rising now. Do I not deserve to protect what's mine too? Or does your right somehow outweigh everyone else's? The argument raged on, each word cutting deeper than the last. They circled each other like opponents in a ring, neither willing to back down. It wasn't just about water anymore. It was pride, resentment, and years of pent-up frustration spilling over. Every insult hurled felt personal. Every accusation stung like salt in an open wound. The longer they argued, the more futile it seemed. Neither was going to change the other's mind. As the shouting match continued, curious neighbors began to gather. At first, it was just a few people passing by, drawn by the commotion. But soon, a small crowd formed, whispering among themselves as they watched the drama unfold. Some sided with Harold, nodding along as he defended his actions. Others quietly cheered Emily on, seeing her boldness as a stand against selfishness. The divide in the community became painfully clear, with tensions simmering just beneath the surface. Finally, someone stepped forward, a woman named Ruth, who ran the local general store and was known for her level-headedness. "Enough," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. Both Emily and Harold turned to look at her, startled by the interruption. "This isn't solving anything," Ruth said firmly, planting her hands on her hips. "Yelling at each other won't bring the rain back or fill the creek. All it's doing is tearing this town apart." Her words struck a nerve. Slowly the crowd fell silent, the weight of her observation sinking in. Emily and Harold exchanged a glance, their anger momentarily overshadowed by shame. They both knew she was right. This fight wasn't just about them anymore. It had become a symbol of the larger struggle facing Willow Creek. And yet, admitting that didn't make the problem disappear. After a long pause, Harold muttered, "Fine. Let's say we agree to disagree. What happens now? Clearly we can't share the creek, not after everything that's happened." Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She hadn't thought this far ahead. Her plan had been simple: redirect the water and force Harold to negotiate. But now, faced with the reality of the situation, she realized it wasn't enough. Simply taking control wouldn't fix anything, not permanently. There had to be another way. Ruth must have sensed her hesitation because she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Maybe it's time to involve someone outside of this feud, someone impartial who can help mediate." At first, Emily bristled at the suggestion. Bringing in outsiders felt like surrender, like admitting defeat. But the longer she considered it, the more sense it made. This wasn't just about her and Harold anymore, it was about the entire town. If they couldn't find a solution together, the drought would destroy them all. Reluctantly, she nodded. "Okay," she said, turning to Harold. "We'll let someone else decide. But only if you agree to abide by their decision, no matter what." Harold hesitated, his jaw tightening. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Fine, but the same goes for you." With that uneasy agreement in place, Ruth suggested reaching out to state officials who specialized in water disputes. It wasn't ideal, but it was a start. As the crowd dispersed and the tension eased, at least temporarily, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. No matter what happened next, one thing was certain: nothing in Willow Creek would ever be the same again. Later that evening, as Emily sat alone on her porch, she stared out at the fields bathed in the golden light of sunset. The sound of running water filled the air, a reminder of the battle she'd fought, and the battles still to come. She didn't know what the future held, but she did know one thing: she wasn't giving up. Not her farm, not her dignity, and certainly not her hope. The days that followed the decision to involve state officials were tense and uncertain. Emily spent most of her time pacing, replaying every detail of the conflict in her mind. She couldn't help but wonder if she'd made the right choice. Bringing in outsiders felt like surrendering control, something she wasn't used to doing. For years, she'd handled everything on her own, fixing broken fences, battling pests, even navigating droughts before this one. But this time was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the entire town, and the stakes were higher than ever. Harold, too, seemed uneasy. Though he rarely spoke about it, his actions betrayed his anxiety. He worked longer hours in the fields, as if trying to distract himself from the looming intervention. His once tidy barnyard now looked disheveled, tools left scattered where they shouldn't be. Even his dog, usually a cheerful companion, seemed to sense the tension, staying close to Harold's side with ears flattened submissively. When the state officials finally arrived in Willow Creek, their presence sent ripples through the community. Two representatives, a woman named Margaret and a man named Carl, came equipped with maps, notebooks, and an air of authority that immediately commanded respect. They wasted no time getting to work, setting up meetings with both Emily and Harold, separately before touring the affected areas. The creek, once a source of life and unity for the town, now felt like a battleground under scrutiny. Margaret and Carl listened intently as Emily explained her side of the story. She described how Harold's dam had cut off her water supply overnight, leaving her crops parched and her future uncertain. Her voice trembled at times, not out of fear but out of sheer frustration. "I didn't have a choice," she said firmly, gesturing toward the trenches and barriers she'd built. "If I hadn't done something, my farm would have been ruined." Carl nodded thoughtfully, jotting notes in his book. "And you believe the creek should flow naturally without interference?" "Yes," Emily replied without hesitation. "It's not just mine or Harold's. It belongs to everyone who relies on it. Diverting all the water to one person doesn't solve anything. It only creates more problems." Later that day, the officials met with Harold. He greeted them with forced politeness, offering coffee and homemade biscuits while maintaining a stiff posture that betrayed his discomfort. When asked about the dam, he defended his actions passionately, arguing that the spring originated on his land and therefore gave him priority rights. "I didn't build that dam to hurt anyone," he insisted, leaning forward earnestly. "I did it because I had no other option. My family depends on this farm. If I lose it, I lose everything." Margaret studied him closely, her expression unreadable. "But surely you understand why others might see your actions as unfair, especially during such a severe drought." Harold sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Of course, I do. Believe me, I've lost sleep over it. But when you're backed into a corner, you make decisions you wouldn't normally make. I'm not proud of what I did, but I can't undo it now." As the officials gathered information, word spread quickly among the townsfolk. Opinions were divided, and emotions ran high. Some supported Emily, seeing her as a symbol of fairness and resilience. Others sided with Harold, believing he had every right to protect his livelihood. Conversations at the general store turned heated, with neighbors exchanging sharp words and icy glares. Ruth tried her best to mediate, reminding everyone that anger wouldn't bring rain or heal the rifts forming within the community. Still, the tension simmered just below the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. Finally, after several days of investigation, Margaret and Carl called a town meeting to present their findings. The community hall buzzed with anticipation as people filed in, taking seats on wooden benches arranged in rows. Emily and Harold sat as far apart as possible, avoiding eye contact entirely. The air was thick with unease, punctuated by the occasional cough or shuffle of feet. When Margaret stood to speak, the room fell silent. She began by acknowledging the complexity of the situation, praising both Emily and Harold for their willingness to cooperate despite their differences. Then she laid out their proposal. The creek would be managed communally, with strict rationing enforced to ensure equal access for all who depended on it. A rotating schedule would determine when each household could draw water, and penalties would be imposed for violations. "This isn't a perfect solution," Margaret admitted, her tone measured but firm. "But it's the fairest way to address the needs of the entire community. We're also recommending the installation of a shared reservoir system to better conserve water for future use." The room erupted into murmurs as people processed the plan, Some nodded approvingly, while others frowned in skepticism. One farmer raised his hand hesitantly. "What happens if someone refuses to follow the rules? Will there be consequences?" Carl stepped forward to answer. "Yes, there will be. Non-compliance will result in fines or legal action. This system only works if everyone participates willingly and responsibly." Emily listened carefully, her heart pounding. On one hand, she appreciated the effort to create a balanced solution. On the other, she worried about whether Harold and others like him would actually abide by the new rules. As if sensing her thoughts, Harold glanced briefly in her direction before looking away again. His expression was unreadable, but she could tell he was processing the same concerns. After the meeting ended, the crowd dispersed slowly, conversations buzzing like bees around a hive. Emily lingered near the doorway, watching as Harold walked briskly toward his truck. Before he could leave, she called out to him, surprising even herself. "Harold, wait." He paused, turning reluctantly to face her. "What is it, Emily?" She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Look, I know we haven't seen eye to eye lately, and maybe we never will. But if this plan is going to work, we need to set aside our differences, for the sake of the town." Harold stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working as though chewing over her words. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You're right. This isn't just about us anymore, but don't expect things to go back to how they were before. Too much has happened." "I'm not asking for that," Emily replied softly. "All I'm asking is that we try to move forward. Together." With that, Harold climbed into his truck and drove off, leaving Emily standing alone in the parking lot. She watched until his taillights disappeared down the road, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. The battle wasn't over, not completely, but for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to survive this drought. Not as enemies, but as neighbors. The weeks that followed the town meeting were a whirlwind of activity and adjustment. The communal water management plan, though far from perfect, was put into motion with surprising efficiency. Teams of volunteers worked tirelessly to install new pipelines and construct the proposed reservoir system. For the first time in months, there was a sense of purpose in Willow Creek, a shared goal that united the community, even if only temporarily. Emily threw herself into the work, her hands blistered and calloused from digging trenches alongside her neighbors. Harold, too, pitched in, though he kept mostly to himself, his contributions quiet but undeniable. At first, the transition was rocky. People struggled to adapt to the strict rationing schedule, grumbling about the inconvenience and arguing over whose turn it was to draw water. Old rivalries resurfaced, and tempers flared more than once. But slowly, as the system began to take shape, the complaints subsided. Neighbors who had once avoided each other started exchanging cautious smiles, then nods of acknowledgement. Conversations became less guarded, and by the end of the first month, the atmosphere in Willow Creek felt lighter, less burdened by anger and mistrust. Emily and Harold remained distant, their interactions limited to brief exchanges during planning meetings or chance encounters at the creek. They never spoke of the conflict directly, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. Neither had emerged victorious, and both had been humbled by the experience. One afternoon, as Emily knelt by the newly constructed reservoir to check its flow, Harold approached hesitantly. She looked up, surprised to see him standing there with a toolbox in hand. "I thought you could use some help," he said awkwardly, gesturing toward the pipes she'd been struggling to connect. "So these fittings can be tricky." For a moment, Emily considered refusing. Pride still lingered between them, a stubborn barrier that refused to crumble entirely. But then she nodded, stepping aside to let him take over. Together, they worked. In silence, their movements synchronized without needing words. When the task was complete, Harold straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Listen," he began, his voice hesitant. I owe you an apology. For everything." Emily blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. "You don't have to." "No," he interrupted, shaking his head. I do. What I did, building that dam, it wasn't right. I let fear get the better of me and I hurt people in the process. You deserved better than that. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she didn't trust herself to speak. Finally, she managed, a small smile. We all make mistakes, Harold. What matters is how we fix them. He nodded, his expression softening. Still, I'm sorry, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right, not just with you, but with everyone. Though their reconciliation was tentative, it marked the beginning of a fragile truce. Over time, small gestures of goodwill helped mend the rift between them. Harold brought fresh eggs to Emily's porch one morning. She returned the favor by sharing surplus vegetables from her garden. Their conversations grew longer, less strained, until they eventually found themselves laughing together again. Tentatively at first, then with genuine warmth. Meanwhile, the town continued to rally around the new water-sharing system. Ruth organized weekly gatherings at the community hall, inviting everyone to share meals and stories. These gatherings became a cornerstone of life in Willow Creek, fostering camaraderie and reminding people of what they stood to lose if they allowed division to fester. Children played games near the reservoir, their laughter echoing through the valley like music. Older residents swapped tips on conserving water, while younger ones learned valuable lessons about cooperation and compromise. As autumn gave way to winter, the rains finally returned. At first, they came in light drizzles, barely enough to dampen the parched earth. But soon, heavier showers rolled in, filling the creeks and reviving the land. The sight of green shoots pushing through the soil brought tears to Emily's eyes. For so long she'd feared the drought would leave permanent scars, not just on the land, but on the spirit of the town. Now, watching the fields come back to life, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the valley in hues of gold and crimson, Emily walked down to the creek. She stood there for a long time, listening to the gentle gurgle of water flowing freely once more. Behind her, footsteps crunched softly against the gravel path. She turned to see Harold approaching, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the creek. His breath formed clouds in the cool air. "It is," Emily agreed, smiling faintly. "Feels like a miracle." Harold chuckled, though there was no humor in it. Only relief. "Maybe it is, or maybe it's just proof that we're stronger when we stick together." They stood side by side in companionable silence, watching the water ripple under the fading light. Neither mentioned the hardships they'd endured or the sacrifices they'd made. Those memories were etched into the fabric of their lives, reminders of how close they'd come to losing everything. Yet here they were, standing on solid ground once more, bound not by friendship alone but by something deeper: resilience. In the months that followed, Willow Creek thrived. Crops flourished, livestock fattened, and the reservoir ensured that even dry spells wouldn't devastate the town again. The scars of the drought remained visible, in cracked riverbeds and weathered fence posts, but they served as testaments to survival rather than defeat. The community had weathered the storm, emerging stronger and more united than ever before. Emily often reflected on those difficult years, marveling at how much had changed. Her relationship with Harold was still a work in progress, but it was enough for now. More importantly, the town had rediscovered its heart, a shared commitment to looking out for one another, even in the face of adversity. As she tended to her fields each morning, the sound of running water in the background, she couldn't help but feel hopeful. Life in Willow Creek wasn't easy, but it was theirs, and they'd fought hard to keep it that way.